Hi, everyone. Welcome to day two of our discussion of Dracula, along with Christopher Kraft's very important and influential article, Kiss Me with Those Red Lips, Desire and Inversion in Dracula. Okay, so let's get into it. So, one of the major topics of Kraft's article is the extent to which the novel both references anxieties around challenges to gender norms in the late 19th century and also the spectacular reinforcement of those gender norms and the way in which that is playing with the genre of the Gothic in ways that we might see are similar to the representation of homophobia in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, something that we've covered before, and if you've taken Lit 265 with me, you are very familiar with, is the extent to which Victorian society was invested in a very strictly defined gender norms and their gender binary, right? What were called the separate spheres. So the idea that it is men's jobs to be active, to go out into the world, to work, to be aggressive, to be involved with public life, whereas it's women's job to take care of the home, to be full of sympathy and empathy, and to take care of the children and to take care of her husband as he is kind of battered around by the ravages of public life. So that society is very, very much invested in essentialist notions of gender and a binary notion of gender. And something that was happening in the late Victorian culture, again, as we've discussed multiple times throughout the semester, is how those norms, that very strict gender binary, was being challenged by decadent authors who are mostly men, but they are specifically rejecting a lot of the bourgeois norms surrounding traditional masculinity, right? They kind of embrace effeminacy, not working, really enjoying the arts, etc. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were feminists or anything like that by any extent of the imagination, but they were rejecting a strict Victorian notions of what it means to be a man. Of course, new women were rejecting traditional notions of what it meant to be a woman in Victorian society by wanting independence and agency, wanting to have professional careers, not wanting to devote their lives to having a husband and having children. And of course, homosexuals, or as they were known at the time, sexual inverts by the very name, were challenging strict notions of a gender binary by embodying the characteristics of one gender in the body of another gender. And this was all discussed in a lot of detail in Elaine Showalter's piece Borderlines from the beginning of the semester, which talked about how strict gender norms in the gender binary were both being deeply challenged in the closing decades of the 19th century, but also as a result, really spectacularly reinforced, right? So as there was more and more subversion, there was also more and more of an attempt to contain that subversion. And that is something that I think we're really seeing happening in Dracula. So, Dracula, as a Gothic novel, is playing with the containment subversion binary, which is typical of that genre. And this is what I mean. So, in a Gothic horror novel, you have some sort of monster or some sort of a monster or a villain who embodies what society views as horrifying or subversive. And then the plot of a Gothic novel is about how that horrible thing is going to be contained and ultimately defeated. So, on the one hand, in order for a Gothic horror novel to work, it has to represent that subversive element, that horrifying element, that monstrous element in the most potent way possible, while at the same time punishing that transgression and conservatively reasserting the norm, right? So it's interesting that even though these novels are on the surface very conservative and ultimately seem to endorse conventional understandings of society and social norms. In order for it to work, it also has to kind of unleash those transgressive energies in order to then contain them. So in Dracula, the thing which is supposed to be both horrifying but also strangely attractive and strangely appealing is, according to Christopher Kraft, the ultimate symbol of this is the mouth of the vampire, right? The mouth of the vampire is both a thing which penetrates, right? It has those sharp teeth that go into your neck to suck your blood, right? It's also, in addition to penetrating, though, it also receives, right? It receives the life giving fluid, which in this case is, of course, blood, but with also other potential symbolic resonances we might think of. It is both phallic insofar as it penetrates, right? But insofar as we can think of the mouth and those red vampire lips, right? It's also a vaginal symbol. It is male and female at once. So the vampire mouth itself confounds the binary, right? Because it contains both masculine and feminine elements, but mixed up and combined into one, which is what makes the mouth of the vampire both horrifying and strangely appealing, right? It's in its ability to combine different gendered aspects. And then we can think of also vampirism as a phenomenon. All of the women that Dracula, all the women Dracula turns into a vampire, such as the vampire sisters that Jonathan Harker encounters at Castle Dracula, or we might think of Lucy, Lucy in the novel, they become very sexually aggressive when they become vampires. And they start wanting to, in a quite literal sense, penetrate men who are passive in the face of their desire, and who actually, when they're in the presence of the vampire woman, desire to be penetrated by them. Of course, in the book, it's penetrated by their teeth into their neck, but again, we can understand the symbolic resonances of this. So we can think of this in connection to the broader discussion we were having earlier this semester about the new woman and the Salome figure, right? The idea that when women are not being policed by patriarchy, when women are allowed to embrace their own desires, not within the limitations of patriarchy, they want to go and castrate men, right? And take their penises away. And I think we're seeing that being worked out in the vampire women in this book. So another way of thinking about it is, what if Theodora, which is about how sexually attractive a Salome figure can be, how appealing she is, what if Theodora was a horror story? If Theodora was a horror story, it would be Dracula, is what I'm suggesting. So when we see Van Helsing and his crew trying to fight Dracula and destroy him, what they're really doing is they're fighting for the reinstatement of traditional gender norms, and they're fighting for reinstatement of the traditional gender binary: men active penetrating, women passive penetrated, right? They're trying to fight Dracula, whose vampirism scrambles that gender binary. So I now want to talk about some of the key gender moments in Dracula that embody what Christopher Kraft is arguing about the vampire and the Dracula's challenge to the gender binary. So the first major moment we can think of is when Jonathan Harker is being kept prisoner in Castle Dracula in the opening chapters of the novel. There's that very memorable scene when he's lying in bed and he's awoken by the three vampire women in Castle Dracula who are attempting to suck his blood. And if you look carefully at the description that Jonathan Harker provides in his diary of how he's feeling at that moment, he says that he is very sexually aroused by the vampire sister, and he's waiting he's lying on the bed and he's waiting with ecstasy for them to suck his blood, right? So that's a moment of perversion for the Victorian audience, right, on Jonathan's part. Because here, Jonathan is being very sexually passive rather than sexually active, and he's eagerly awaiting being penetrated by the women rather than wanting to penetrate the women. Um, so this is an example of how the vampirism is scrambling the gender codes, right? And especially how Jonathan, who's supposed to embody normative bourgeois British masculinity, is being led to embody these quote unquote perverse feminine desires. Um, then, of course, how the scene ends is that right before the women are about to bite into Jonathan, they're interrupted by Dracula, and Dracula tells the women, "Leave him alone. He's mine." Right, and something that Kraft says is that what this calls attention to is the possibility of homoeroticism, right? The possibility that Jonathan will be penetrated by another man, will be penetrated by Dracula. So, of course, the novel never goes on to actually narrate Dracula biting into any man, right? Because that would probably be too transgressive, too homoerotic. But what Kraft says is that in this moment, by bringing up the possibility of Dracula biting into a British man, right? There is this constant, lingering threat of the homoerotic, which is always kind of there in the background, even though it's never explicitly depicted in the novel. Another key moment is Lucy's blood transfusions. So Van Helsing is using this blood transfusion machine, which at this moment would have actually been a very new invention in the 19th century. What he's trying to do is he's trying to save her from becoming a vampire by infusing her with the blood of all of these men. And as you might have noticed, the men that he's calling on to give their blood to Lucy goes from the one who's closest to her, her fiance, and it gets further and further away, right? So in that sense, what Kraft is saying is that by constantly penetrating Lucy and trying to infuse her with this blood from traditional British men, right, is that they're trying to save her from being transgressed, right, from falling into this vampiric transgression. But in that sense, they're also weirdly mirroring Dracula himself in terms of like constantly through penetration trying to create a situation where Lucy will not become a penetrator, i.e., become a vampire. So ultimately, of course, that proves ineffective, as most of the men in the novel who aren't Dracula are fairly ineffective, and she does become a vampire. And when they go to the graveyard and they find out that Lucy is the boofer lady, right, who's been stealing the children, two things happen. One, they realize that she is actually sucking the blood of children, right, which makes her into an anti-maternal figure, right? Traditionally, children, get their nourishment from their mothers through breastfeeding. Here, it's the opposite, right, where the woman is actually feeding on children in a disturbing, perverse way. The other thing that you probably noticed is that Lucy, as a vampire, is very sexy and seductive, right? Where she is trying to get Arthur to come and be penetrated by her, be bitten by her, using her sexual charms. And Arthur is almost successfully seduced by her. So in order to save her from being this very sexual anti-mother, in order to save her from being this kind of Salome figure, they ultimately have to do the ultimate penetration to her which is stabbing her through the heart with a wooden stake. And once that happens, she becomes passive and still once again. In other words, once she has the stake through her heart and is truly dead, is no longer a vampire, she returns to this image of very traditional Victorian femininity. And in the eyes of the men, they think like, oh, well, we've actually saved her, right? We've done this good thing to her by, yes, like killing her again, but also returning her to traditional gender norms. So some connections I wanted to make here was uh, how Kraft makes a very similar point to that made by Arata in the Occidental Tourist article, which is the extent to which Dracula is characterized by a fight between men, right? Between Van Helsing and his crew and Dracula over who will be culturally dominant. And that fight is waged over who will control women's bodies. Will Dracula control women's bodies and make them perverse and sexually open, or is Van Helsing and his crew going to win and assert a victory for traditional femininity? Something else I wanted to mention was how after Dracula and more into the modern era, we start to see more and more narratives that are about either sympathetic or tragic vampires. We might think of Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, for instance, or we might think of the TV show True Blood, where we're supposed to have some sort of sympathy for the vampire, and the way in which that interestingly tracks with growing social sympathy towards figures who are either transgressive or socially marginal. Whereas here in the novel Dracula, we're seeing just kind of pure hostility towards transgressive and marginal figures. In later narratives, we see more sympathy towards vampires as symbols of social transgression or social marginality. So, to discuss on Facebook this week, what I'd like you to do is I want you to close read any of the scenes mentioned in the article, or in fact, any other scenes from the novel that you think are relevant. And I want you to examine how the novel both elicits transgressive sexual desires, but also shuts down those transgressive sexual desires. So, what we were talking about at the beginning of today's mini lecture. And I thought it might be interesting to relate this to Foucault's discussion of how Victorian society used obsessive preoccupation with sex as a means of social control. So, if you'll recall, something that Foucault says is that what Victorian society did was it made sex seem super important and super dangerous to get people obsessed with the possibility of sexual transgression in a kind of negative sense, and then how that operated as a form of social control. So I wanted you to think about how Dracula might be doing that same thing, right? The way in which it is both ostensibly asserting very traditional sexual norms, but is only doing so by playing with and representing forms of sexual perversion and sexual transgression. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Bye.